Have you ever stopped, really stopped, to think about what it means to be alive? Not the chase for dreams, not the search for success, but the raw, undeniable truths that silently follow us every single day. Truths we don't dare look at, not because we don't know them, but because we're afraid. Among them, two silent companions, aging and illness. They don't care if you're a king or a beggar. They come without warning. And they stay whether you invite them or not, while we chase pleasure, while we lose ourselves in ambition. They walk quietly beside us, waiting, until we finally notice them. In Buddhism, we don't turn away from these things. We face them, not with fear, not with despair, but with wisdom. There's an old story. A powerful king named Paisnati. He once asked the Buddha, "Is there anything anyone in this world can escape?" And the Buddha replied, "There are two things no being can outrun, aging and illness." Simple words, but inside them an ocean of truth. We spend our lives clinging to things, our youth, our beauty, our strength, but all of it is destined to fade. And while most of the world runs from this truth, Buddhism invites us to lean in. Look around you. Entire industries built on the fantasy of eternal youth, wrinkles erased, hair dyed, sickness hidden behind walls and hospital curtains. But no matter how hard we fight, aging comes, illness follows, and pretending otherwise only makes their arrival more painful. Yet here's the part most people miss. Buddhism teaches they aren't enemies, they are teachers. Silent, patient, honest teachers. When we're young, we think we're invincible, but one illness, one injury. And suddenly, life looks different. We begin to ask, who am I without this body? What matters when the outer layers fall away? What was ever truly mine to begin with? These aren't moments of weakness, they're moments of awakening. A great master once said, "Health hides what illness reveals." When your body's strong, you forget it's temporary. When it falters, you remember. And here's where freedom begins, not in avoiding aging and illness, but in understanding them, recognizing they come because you're alive, and because everything born must one day fade. It's not a curse, it's nature. Monks in monasteries meditate on this daily, not out of fear, but to embrace life's preciousness. Every sunrise is beautiful, because it won't last. Every breath matters, because one day it will be your last. And strangely, it's in knowing this that you truly begin to live, because once you stop clinging to what can't stay, you open your heart to what's real, compassion, clarity, peace. So perhaps the question isn't how to avoid aging and illness, but how. There's a strange thing about the human heart. We crave certainty. We build walls, routines, and dreams, hoping they'll shield us from life's sharp edges. But no matter how carefully we craft our lives, there's one truth that slips through every crack. We suffer, and it's not because life is cruel, it's because we're human. Buddhism in its most honest form begins here, with a truth so raw, so undeniable, that most people spend their whole lives running from it. It's called Dukkha, a word often translated as suffering. But it's more than just pain. It's the discomfort of impermanence, the ache of not being able to hold on, the quiet, restless tension of knowing everything we love will one day change. Aging and illness aren't exceptions to this truth. They're some of its clearest expressions. Think about it. That first gray hair, the faint ache in your back after a long day, the illness that lingers longer than it should. These aren't random inconveniences. They're life reminding you. This body you cherish is temporary, and yet we resist. We paint over the cracks. We pop pills to numb the pain. We chase youth like it's a trophy we can keep forever. But Buddhism teaches something different. It says, don't run, look closer, because hidden within this suffering is wisdom. Dukkha isn't here to torment you, it's here to wake you up. The Buddha's very first teaching, after his great awakening under the Bodhi tree, was about this truth. He gathered a small group of seekers and said, there is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Separation from what you love is suffering. Getting what you don't want is suffering. It was bold, it was honest, and it was necessary, because you can't heal what you refuse to see, and you can't find peace by denying life's sharp edges. But here's the part that most miss. The Buddha wasn't trying to depress anyone. He wasn't offering a dark, hopeless worldview. He was offering freedom, because once you see suffering for what it is, once you stop fighting it, you begin to see the way out. Aging and illness then aren't punishments. They're natural signs pointing to a deeper truth. They show us what is fragile, what is temporary, what was never meant to be ours forever. And strangely, that's where real peace begins. When you stop expecting the body to stay young, you suffer less when wrinkles appear. When you understand illness as part of nature's rhythm, you waste less time asking, "Why me?" Instead, you ask, "How can I meet this moment with grace? What can this teach me? What is this life really for?" Dukkha isn't a problem to solve. It's a teacher to learn from. And aging and illness as forms of dukkha are some of life's most profound instructors. They strip away the illusion of control. They humble us. They remind us of our shared humanity, because no matter your status, your wealth, your fame, no one escapes them. And in that common fate, there's compassion. You begin to see yourself in the elderly man moving slowly down the street, in the child lying sick in a hospital bed, in the mother struggling through chemotherapy. You realize their pain is your pain, and that awareness changes everything. This is why monks meditate on impermanence, why they walk through graveyards, why they contemplate their own aging bodies, not because they're morbid, but because they want to live fully, unclinging, unattached, awake. And you don't have to be a monk to do the same. You can feel the breath in your chest right now. And no, it won't always be there. You can look at your reflection in the mirror and bow to the one who is slowly changing. You can visit someone who's ill and recognize the preciousness of your own health without taking it for granted. This is the wisdom Buddhism offers, not a promise of escape, but an invitation to wake up, to live deeply, to love fiercely, to let go gracefully. Because when you stop clinging to what will inevitably leave, what remains is peace. And in that space of clarity, a new question begins to rise. If aging and illness are inevitable, and if suffering follows where we cling, then how do we meet this fragile, fleeting life? Without fear, how do we navigate it? With wisdom in our hearts and compassion in our hands, let's go deep. It's strange, isn't it? The things we try so hard to avoid often turn out to be our greatest teachers. We spend years chasing youth, dreading sickness, fearing the slow decline of age. And yet, when those inevitable moments arrive, something unexpected happens. If we're willing to stay present, if we're brave enough to look suffering in the eye, we discover a hidden gift, wisdom, not the kind you read in books, not the kind handed down through clever words, but the wisdom born from experience, the wisdom of seeing what truly matters when everything else is stripped away. Aging and illness have a way of cutting through life's noise, the petty worries, the endless ambitions, the constant craving for more. Suddenly, when you're staring down your own limitations, the things you once thought were so important start to feel strangely small. That perfect car, that job promotion, the number of followers on a screen. In the face of a frail body or a failing heart, they lose their power, and what remains are the things that always mattered most: love, presence, compassion, the ability to be here now, fully awake to your fleeting, precious life. Buddhism teaches us that every experience holds potential for awakening, but it's often suffering that opens the door. The Buddha himself left a life of luxury. He saw an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and those encounters shattered the illusion of permanence. They cracked open his heart and set him on a path toward understanding. In the same way, when we face our own aging bodies, when illness interrupts our carefully laid plans, we too are offered an invitation to let go, to release the tight grip we have on youth and certainty. And in that letting go, clarity arises. You begin to realize that life was never about holding on. It was about learning to meet each moment with grace, about loving fully even when things fall apart. about finding peace, not by controlling life, but by flowing with it. This is the hidden gift of suffering. It humbles us, it softens us, it strips away the false stories we tell ourselves. And when we're no longer clinging to those stories, we can see the world more clearly. Aging reminds us that we are part of nature's rhythm, that every flower wilts, every sunset fades, and every living thing eventually returns to the earth. Illness shows us how interconnected we are, how much we need each other, how precious even an ordinary, healthy day can be. And in those moments of clarity, you realize that wisdom was never something to be gained. It was something already within you, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. The old Zen masters often spoke of the beauty in imperfection: a cracked teacup, a weathered face, a gnarled ancient tree. These weren't flaws to be hidden. They were marks of time, proof of a life fully lived, in your own aging, in your own suffering. There is a quiet beauty too, not the kind celebrated on magazine covers, but the kind that comes from having loved, having lost, and still choosing to open your heart again. This is why Buddhist monks meditate on death, not to be morbid, but to remember how fragile and therefore precious each moment is. When you know your time is limited, you speak kinder words, you hold your loved ones a little closer, you savor the warmth of the sun on your skin, you waste less time chasing illusions, and spend more time being present. Aging and illness have a way of bringing this wisdom home. They remind us of the impermanence we tried to forget, and in doing so, they offer us a gift, not a gift we would have chosen, but one we deeply need: the chance to wake up, to see clearly, to live with greater courage, tenderness, and awareness, because once you've faced your own vulnerability, you become softer with others. You understand the silent struggles behind a stranger's eyes. You hold space for people's pain. You walk through the world. When life humbles you, when suffering cracks your heart wide open, something else often awakens within you. Not fear, not bitterness, but compassion. A tenderness that rises not because everything is perfect, but because you finally understand what it means to hurt, to be human, to be fragile. And it's in this tenderness that Buddhism plants one of its most beautiful seeds, a teaching not confined to temples or ancient scrolls, but lived, breathed, and shared in the ordinary moments of caring for one another. In the Buddhist tradition, compassion isn't a lofty idea. It's a practice, a way of moving through the world, a conscious choice to soften instead of harden, to reach out instead of turn away. And nowhere is this more sacred than in the care of the sick, the aging, and the dying. You see, in ancient Buddhist communities, it wasn't just monks who cared for the sick, it was everyone. The Buddha himself, during his lifetime, tended to a sick monk abandoned by others. When asked why he did it, he replied with gentle certainty, "Whoever would care for me should care for the sick." It's a simple truth we often forget, that the measure of a person, of a society, is not in how it celebrates the powerful or the beautiful, but in how it treats those who are suffering, unseen, and fading from view. In Buddhist monasteries, it became tradition that the one caring for the sick would do so as if tending to the Buddha himself. Every act, washing a face, offering water, speaking a kind word, became a form of meditation, a sacred offering, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that in each frail body, in each struggling breath, is the same life force you carry within you. And if you look closely enough, the boundary between self and other begins to dissolve. This isn't just about charity, it's about connection. When you sit beside someone in pain, and you don't rush to fix or to flee, you touch something ancient and holy. You see your own future reflected in their eyes. And strangely, you find yourself becoming softer, kinder, more patient with the small complaints of your own life. In the West, we often treat illness as a problem to solve, an interruption to the rhythm of real life. But Buddhism invites us to see sickness differently, not as an enemy, but as a profound teacher. And in caring for those who are sick, we aren't just offering comfort to them, we're awakening wisdom within ourselves. It teaches us impermanence, that the body you cherish, the youth you cling to, will someday falter. It reminds us of interdependence, that none of us are as separate or self-sufficient as we pretend. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals the depth of our shared humanity. The Buddhist way of care isn't about heroic gestures. It's about presence, about sitting by a bedside without needing to fill the silence, about offering a cup of tea not as a task but as a moment of connection, about touching a hand not to heal but to remind someone they're not alone. These are small, ordinary acts, and yet, in the language of compassion, they speak volumes. There's a story told in Zen circles of a student who asked his teacher, "Master, how do you practice mindfulness?" The master replied, "When I eat, I eat. When I sleep, I sleep. When I care for the sick, I care for the sick." No grand philosophy, just full attention, undivided presence, a heart available in the moment. And perhaps this is the deepest offering we can give to anyone in pain. Not perfect words, not quick fixes, but ourselves, our willingness to be with them, without flinching, without fleeing, because in those quiet, unspoken moments, something extraordinary happens. Suffering becomes shared, and in that sharing it becomes lighter, more bearable, and both the one receiving care and the one offering it are transformed. This is compassion in action, the living heart of Buddhist wisdom, a practice that reminds us that to care for another is to care for yourself, that healing is not always about curing, but about witnessing, loving, and accompanying someone through their darkest hour. And when you live this way, when compassion becomes your instinct, the whole world begins to soften around you. Every person you meet carries their own invisible wounds, and you begin to greet them not with judgment, but with gentleness, because you've seen what pain looks like, and you've learned that the only thing that truly soothes it is love made visible. And so, as we move forward, a quiet question lingers in the air. If this is what it means to truly care, how might it change not only how we treat the sick, but how we live every ordinary day of our fleeting, fragile lives? Let's keep walking. Pain has a way of shrinking the world. When your body aches, when illness grips you tight, the past blurs, the future fades, and all that remains is the raw, immediate now. Every breath feels heavier, every movement becomes a struggle. Even simple joys, sunlight through the window, a familiar voice can seem distant, unreachable. It's here, in this fragile, unforgiving space, that Buddhism offers one of its most powerful, tender gifts, not the promise of escape, not the illusion of control, but a way to face pain, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a truth to be witnessed. This way is called mindfulness. Mindfulness, sati in Pali, isn't a fancy technique reserved for monks on a distant mountaintop. It's an ancient, accessible art, a simple, courageous decision to pay attention, to notice the waves of sensation as they rise and fall, without flinching, without clinging, without drowning in them. The Buddha never denied pain. In fact, he spoke of it often. In his famous teaching of the two arrows, he explained, "When life strikes us with physical pain, it's like being shot by an arrow. That's unavoidable, part of having a body, part of living. But then we often shoot ourselves with a second arrow. The mental anguish, the resistance, the why me, the fear, the anger, the hopelessness. And it's this second arrow that multiplies our suffering. Mindfulness invites us to lay down the second arrow, to feel what's there, the ache, the tightness, the burning, but without adding stories of doom or despair. It doesn't mean pretending it doesn't hurt. It means noticing. This is pain. This is its texture. This is how it moves. And in that noticing, something subtle, almost miraculous happens. Pain begins to lose its grip, not because it vanishes, but because you stop fighting it. You stop drowning in the fear of the next moment. You anchor yourself in the one you have, and often you discover that this very moment, difficult as it is bearable. In Buddhist practice, this is done through breath awareness. Even in sickness, even in bed, the breath remains. The gentle rise and fall, the quiet, constant companion. By bringing awareness to each inhalation, each exhalation, you create a space within pain, a pocket of calm within the storm. In many monasteries, you'll find the sick and elderly practicing this quietly. A subtle smile, a hand resting gently on the chest. Breathing in, I am here. Breathing out, this is okay. No need to push the pain away. No need to pull it closer. Simply allowing it to be. There's a story of an elderly monk, gravely ill, his body failing. A visitor asked him how he endured such relentless discomfort, and the monk, with a weary smile, said, "I let the pain be pain. I do not let it become suffering." This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom around illness, that while the body may weaken, the mind, when trained in awareness, can remain vast, clear, and compassionate. And in that clarity, even pain becomes a kind of teacher. It teaches patience. It reveals what truly matters. It strips away the illusions we've clung to about control, permanence, and invincibility. It reminds us that our worth is not tied to how perfectly our bodies function, but to the tenderness we can offer ourselves and others, even in struggle. Mindfulness also breaks the loneliness of illness, because when you rest your awareness in this breath, in this moment, you touch the same space within yourself that every human, every being has known. That place beyond words, beyond roles, beyond broken bodies. And you realize, I am not alone in this. Others have walked this path. Others are walking it now. And in some way we walk it together. The beauty of mindfulness is that it requires no perfection. Even if your thoughts wander, even if fear arises, you can always begin again, with one breath, with one kind, curious glance inward. It's not a cure, it's a refuge, a place where, even in the midst of pain, you can touch peace, not by escaping what is, but by meeting it with honesty and love. And perhaps, in the quiet space mindfulness opens, we remember something easy to forget in illness, that though our bodies may betray us, there is a part of us awake, aware, infinite. That pain can never touch. And as we journey forward, let's carry this understanding with us. Because while pain may visit our bodies, it need not consume our hearts. And in the wisdom of each mindful breath, we discover that even in the hardest moments, there is still a place of deep, quiet freedom. Our bodies are like delicate vessels, fragile, impermanent, and endlessly changing. Yet so often we cling to them as if they define who we truly are. We invest our identity in the reflection of youth, the strength of health, the contours of appearance. But Buddhism teaches us a deeper truth. The body is only a temporary home. The art of non-attachment invites us to gently loosen this grip, not through denial or cold detachment, but through a compassionate understanding that the body is a passing phenomenon. It ages, it weakens, it eventually dissolves, and holding on too tightly only deepens our suffering. When illness and aging confront us with the inevitability of decline, they become a profound invitation to practice letting go, to see the body not as the self, but as a precious, yet transient friend on life's journey. The Buddha called this insight the realization of anicca, impermanence. Everything conditioned arises and passes away, including our flesh and bones. By observing this truth directly, through mindfulness and reflection, we begin to soften our attachments. This is not easy. Our culture teaches us to resist, to fight, to fix. But non-attachment is a different path, a path of embracing reality as it is. It means allowing ourselves to experience the changes in the body without fear or clinging. Imagine holding a leaf in your hand. You admire its color, its texture, its life, but you know it will eventually dry and fall. You don't squeeze it to keep it alive. You simply appreciate its beauty, and then you gently release it. So too with the body. The art of letting go teaches us to release not just the physical form, but also the stories, fears, and identities built around it. We learn to say, this body is not mine to keep forever. It is changing, and that is okay. In Buddhist practice, this letting go opens a space for freedom. The mind is no longer chained to the illusion of permanence. Instead, It learns to rest in the flow of life's natural rhythms. There are beautiful practices that support this journey. Meditations on impermanence, loving kindness towards the body, and contemplations on death and rebirth. Through these, we cultivate a fearless embrace of reality, not as something to be controlled or feared, but as a constant, unfolding mystery. Many enlightened teachers have spoken of this release as a doorway to peace. One ancient story tells of a monk who, when his body was near death, smiled gently and said, "I am not the body that fades, I am the awareness that watches." This awareness, unaffected by aging, illness, or death, is the true essence Buddha points us to. And by practicing non-attachment to the body, we begin to glimpse that vast, unchanging space within. So as we walk the path through aging and illness, let us remember that letting go is not loss. It is liberation, a tender surrender to what is, and a welcoming of what lies beyond. Aging and illness, two realities that touch every life, yet so often met with fear, resistance, or denial. But what if we shifted our perspective? What if, instead of enemies to be battled, they became wise teachers, guides along the path? Buddhism invites us to embrace these experiences not as burdens, but as profound lessons in impermanence, compassion, and presence. Each wrinkle, each ache, each moment of vulnerability carries a message. Life is fragile. Life is precious. Life is happening now. When we welcome aging and illness as teachers, we open ourselves to a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. We learn humility, patience, and gratitude. We discover how to soften our hearts, not only to ourselves but to all beings who suffer. This is the final lesson the Buddha imparts: to see clearly, with open eyes and open hearts, the interconnected dance of joy and sorrow, health and sickness, birth and death. By embracing these truths, we awaken to a life lived fully, a life where even decline and discomfort hold meaning. There's a saying in the Buddhist tradition, "Suffering is the mother of awakening." And indeed, aging and illness often become the midwives of wisdom. Through their gentle, sometimes harsh teachings, we learn to cherish the present moment with greater clarity. So as you walk your own path through these inevitable changes, remember that you are not alone. Each breath, each step, each experience is a chance to awaken deeper compassion, both for yourself and for all beings walking this journey. If this message resonates with you, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and let's explore these teachings together. Because the path of wisdom and compassion is one best traveled hand in hand. Thank you for walking this journey with me. May you find peace in